Well, you know, I belong to this little church down here, and I looked around, and churches are my big thing when we go overseas, especially from, I've studied the history of architecture quite a while, and they all of them seem to have had these stations of the cross, and I wondered why our little church down here in Plettenberg Bay didn't have a set of stations of the cross. And then by some madness I got elected to the Chapelry Council, and I asked them one day, why don't we have a set of stations of the cross? And they've been done by everybody. Raphael, anybody's done a set of stations of the cross. And they said, well, nobody quite knew. So I said, well, I think we should have one. I think it really would be very nice. They said, how do we go about it? And I said, well, what happens if I make for you a proposal? And they said, yeah, good idea. So I made a proposal, and in my proposal I drew a set of 14 stations of the cross. And there I put them together in a booklet, and I showed it to everybody, and some liked it, some didn't like it, some weren't sure. Eventually, after quite a long time, we presented them to, first of all, a committee, and then to a tea of the church, and after 6 months they decided that they should vote on whether they wanted them or not. And they did. And 14 of the congregation voted that they really liked the idea, because by then I'd made the first one, which I hung on the wall of the church to give them a feel. Then they looked at it, and we then had this, after quite a while, we had this big meeting in the church. Tea was provided and everything. Everyone was given a voting paper, which they then took, and they voted, and there were 14 against and 58 for. So suddenly we're having the stations of the cross. And I started, and then suddenly we had COVID-19. Well, I was glued in here in my studio here, and I had not much to do, and I decided now's the time to get going on the stations of the cross. And I told them I would need a year to do them, because I thought it would probably take a month each. But of course, when you're working on 14, and by now they wanted an extra one, 15, in fact there's a whole series of procedures so that the procedures can overlap. So whereas they still take a month each to make, they actually, you can do in 2 months, you can do probably 4 or 5. And I start off with a base. In here I cast a base, and I reinforce it with wire that I collect from electricians, which they pair off the ends of electric cables, and I bend these into a shape, and I put them in there to reinforce them. And I then cast myself a base, and then I take the finer wire, and I then wind them into the shapes that I want, that I think I want, and I then plaster them up, and I overplaster them, and I wait for it to dry, and then I start to carve. And then I find that I'm a bit short here, a bit short there, so I add some more, and I carve some more. And so that is really the procedure. But the stations of the cross themselves are really very interesting, because in the good old days not everybody could read, and this was a way that you got the lessons over to your congregation, and this is how you taught them. And these were very simple illustrations that could depict Christ's last journey to Golgotha, and to meet with the cross and his destiny, and your and my destiny, because it was by that means that he came to save our souls. So now we've got a very, very simple, plain church. And now what I had in mind with these stations of the cross is something quite simple, white on white as it were. And because normally when you see the stations of the cross, you're all going in procession at Easter time and gathering around each one while part of the ceremony is done, and while the priest gives the sermon on that particular station of the cross. This one is the Station of the Cross, and it depicts the moment that Christ dies on the cross. I took this inspiration from Salvador Dali's famous painting with Christ almost floating through the stratosphere, high above the ground, people at the bottom looking up to see him go, and almost going to meet his maker in the sky. And so that's this particular story. And so it goes on in this sort of vein. And this is the one I'm working on now, and there are always some Roman soldiers involved. I've got 3 or 4 Roman soldiers and some pilgrim chaps at the bottom. And then I carve and I work away at it until the image all comes together. And I think some of them are really nice, some of them are interesting. Some of them haven't got that much interest to work into the image. And so in our particular church, I've had to make them very simple, because you can't perambulate around the church getting close to them, so you've got to see them from far. And that's why this image is very strong, because if you look at it from far, it's got striking shadows and it's got deep recesses, and so that it does strike your attention. And even if you can't see all the little details, doesn't matter, because there'll be an opportunity when you're sitting in that row in the church when you look up and pick up the details. And so that's how the stations were put together. And this one is, he comes in at the end here, he's number 12, and there's a hole that I've designed in here for where he fits in, and so he fits. The next station is where they actually nail him to the cross. Now, I don't know how one would nail someone to the cross, but I imagine this crude timber cross being thrown on the ground, and Christ forcefully taken and held down while they hammered this nail into his hands and nailed him to the cross. And this cross would have been lying on vegetation, on a lawn, on flowers, on grass. And so I have this mad contrast in my head of this rough, cruel thing happening, but it's happening on a bed of flowers. When I'm carving big things, big shapes, then the plaster must be quite soft, because that's it. Then I can sculpt them with a degree of bravura. Whereas when I'm dealing with little details, I like this plaster to be hard, almost like stone already. And it does, it gets like stone, it gets strong as anything. And here I'm carving this Roman soldier, and hoping he's going to be a nice one, because sometimes they turn out nice and sometimes they don't. And then I've got to work more on them. I want them to be a reminder of this COVID epidemic that with the Boei, not only in Plettenberg Bay, but it's the whole country, the whole state, the whole planet almost is suffering from this dreaded disease. And so I'd like these stations in a small way, very small way, to become a monument and dedicate this as a monument to all those who suffered and died in this COVID pandemic. I don't want to get it too smart, I don't want to get it too polished, because I think one must leave a lot to one's own artistic perception. You know, people have an eye, you see what you, if it's a bit vague and a bit rough, you see in it what you want to see in it. You know, you don't always believe what other people tell you about what you should see. And that's right, isn't that right? You know, I think it's probably the peace of sitting and the joy of discovery. You know, like the best way I can describe it is when I made that crucifix with the hands, not the crucifix where the hand is nailed to the cross. What I did is I threw really quite raw plaster, quite soft raw plaster all about, and I waved it around really like I was playing with mud in the sand or sea. And then once it's set, I started to look deep into it, and I would find images. I would find a little thing which looked like a flower on the one side, and I would find a pile of plaster that somehow looked like a kind of cactus plant, and so images just crept out of it. That was that unveiling of that sort of mystery for me was really a lot of excitement, because you just put down stuff, and heaven forbid, there in the middle of it all, that you didn't even know, there are flowers and grass and stuff. And that's why I think that I found very interesting. But I think the piece of just being in this little workshop, working away, front door open because it's my garage, and people walking past and everyone coming in there and chatting and finding out how we're going today and what we're doing today, all of that sort of stuff, I think is very nice. And you know, in COVID, a lot of people were very, very, well, they were alone. Some were lonely, and people were looking for someone to talk to. And boy, oh boy, this is a bit like when you're painting on a scene in a foreign city. People come and look and they talk because people want to have somebody to talk to. And there I was, and I made nice friends, and people came and told me their thoughts, and all of it is wonderful. So that I liked very much. And I think the main journey is for me myself, to the journey of discovery, which happens just by doing. You know, while I'm doing this, I'm working on who's this guy. Like there's a guy here who looks like really a handicapped fella, but he's not. He's sort of looking at a funny angle at the top. But I think he's got like such a pure sense of worship in him, and he's so rough and crude, and I wish I could make him better, but I don't want to, because I then might mess him up, because he's just wonderful. Just a wonderful guy. Just, yeah. Friend of mine, I told him I was doing this. He's a fellow artist, chap I spent my whole university, he and I together, worked together. And he said, I hope you're not doing it realistically. And I said, well, you won't believe this, but I'm trying to do it as realistic as I can, but without being too fussy with the detail. And so that's where we're at. It's all different. There we go. Oh, it's coming together. Coming together. Yeah, this guy's coming right. Ah. Oi. Ah. Ay, ay. There we go. Right, you go. Pack it all up. Close up the shop.